Welcome to today's event for the Hostry Festival. Thank you very much to Stash and the Hostry Festival team for inviting me to come along today. I think that my guest this afternoon is known to all of us. He's been part of our, or certainly the county's, ecclesiastical life for the last 19 years. He's certainly made an incredible impression upon Norfolk and throughout his ministry and the many institutions and charities that he supported in that time. He was, of course, as we know, retiring next month, and he'll be sorely missed. But this afternoon we have a chance to hear about his life, and afterwards, if you'd like to ask any questions, then he's very happy to answer them. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Lord Bishop of Norwich, the Right Revd Graham James. So, firstly, thank you very much for joining us here this afternoon.
Pleasure.
Very nice to see you. I guess this is a busy time right now. I guess Wednesdays are as busy as any day of the week, and you're tying up all the loose ends.
Well, it'd be good to tie up the loose ends. I don't think I'll manage it, but I'm going to give myself a bit of time after the final service in the cathedral to disengage for a couple of months from organisations, national jobs, and finding people to take on some of the jobs I've got, other willing volunteers. So I'm looking for conscripts on the way out for various trusteeships and so on.
Right. Well, let's just take you back before Norwich, before ordination, before university. Let's go right back to childhood. You were born in Devon,
in Torrington, in Devon,
Torrington,
yes,
right.
but of Cornish parentage. They just happened to be there. So I am full-blooded Cornish, but was born in Devon. I mean, it's a bit of a pity, but there we are. You can't help it.
Tell me about your parents.
Well, my family came from between Redruth and Camborne in Cornwall, which is Cornwall's tin mining area. What John Betjeman once described as Cornwall's slough. Come friendly bombs and fall on slough. It's industrial Cornwall. People often think of Cornwall only in terms of beautiful beaches, but of course it's a place of heavy industry and mining. My father was a labourer on a tin mine. My mother was a shop assistant. They met in their local Methodist chapel. The Anglican parish that they grew up in, which is still there and has a parish church and two daughter churches, in my childhood had 37 Methodist chapels in that one Anglican parish. 37. Doesn't anymore, but it was extraordinary even in the 1950s. In fact, my father was a local preacher. He then became a congregational minister, and that's what took him to Torrington in Devon. He took on a small church there, and when I was 18 months old, moved back to Newquay. So he left tin mining and became a nonconformist minister and became the minister of Newquay Congregational Church. I mean, this was only because the Methodists in those days, if you were over the age of 25, you could not candidate for ministry. You had to be 25 or under. So it's an extraordinarily different world at the beginning of just after the Second World War. All that changed quite quickly. So we ended up, I grew up in Newquay in Cornwall, right next to Fistral Beach, the great surfing beach, for those of you who know it. In the days, of course, before foreign holidays, and in the 50s, it was a pretty major resort of, it hadn't then gone rather more down market as it went later, although it's trying to lift itself up again. And it was a very happy childhood, really. I mean, idyllic. I mean, when I look back on it, you wouldn't allow your child to do it now. But at the age of 6, I walked about half a mile to school on my own. Nobody thought about that being dangerous. Whereas now I'd have to be taken in a 4x4 or a Pantechnicon, wouldn't I? Really.
And at the age of 11, you moved to Northampton, is that right?
Yes.
Why did the family move to Northampton?
Well, that's another, we moved to the town, I think, that's furthest from the sea that you can get really in this country, and that was another change in my father's life. I mean, he was ecclesiastically restless and decided to become an Anglican priest, and went off to theological college in Birmingham, left us in Cornwall. We moved to Northampton, where he was going to be a curate. he was the best paid minister in the southwest for Congregationalism. I think he was on 1,000 a year and went down to 450 a year as an Anglican curate. So my mother, when I look back on it, I mean, she was remarkable really to put up with it. And we ended up in Northampton even before he got there. And I was pretty bewildered because at the age of 11, you know, you lose your friends and you have to make new ones. So I went off to Northampton Grammar School, and actually it was the making of me probably and the family, because it was a great school to go to. And
what were your favourite topics?
Well, skiving, I suppose, was my main. I mean, I can't say that I was ever a perfect child. It's interesting. I was never made a prefect. You know, nobody thrust greatness on me, partly because I was in detention too often. And it's interesting, in the House of Bishops, there's one or two of my colleagues who I say, oh, I bet he was a head prefect. You can sort of tell, can't you, sometimes. But that wasn't me, and I enjoyed playing rugby and cricket. I'd always enjoyed being on stage and, you know, doing drama.
Really?
Yeah, and I suppose in those days, I mean, English and history were always my favourite subjects. But I didn't think of myself as particularly academic. But you were, the extraordinary thing, a bit like being in this place, you know, when I noticed with my son when he was here, is that you were surrounded in that grammar school by very clever kids, and so, you know, you were encouraged to compete, really, and there was a sort of expectation of achievement, and I don't think anybody ever told me you must go to university. But I sort of picked it up, you know, you stayed on to do A-levels, you know, my parents had left school at 14, but there was an expectation of achievement, and you sort of buy into it, and so it never occurred to me really that, well, I suppose I also thought, well, I didn't know quite what I wanted to do at 18. I applied to university to read economics. I then changed to English as soon as I got there, and then I changed to history at the end of my first year, and then went on, of course, to read theology after that. So, I mean, I was, as you can see, I was a very decisive person. You know.
So, clearly history then held an interest for you. Is there a particular period of English history that fascinates you the most?
We were doing more about Tudors and Stuarts even in my day at school, partly because they were the most glamorous bits of history. And I suppose, if I'm honest, it's that period of the Reformation which has always interested me. Although at university my specialist area was the English Civil War, and my professor tried to persuade me when I was going off to read theology from Lancaster. I'd already candidated as a candidate for ordination, and he thought it was a bit of a waste that I was going into the ministry of the Church of England, because I had written an essay, or I'd done it longer than an essay, on the protectorate of Richard Cromwell, you know, Oliver's son, who was his inherited Lord Protector for about 18 months before the restoration of the monarchy. And he was impressed by this and said, in fact he offered me, as you did in those days, I mean, I had a 2-1, but I didn't have a first, but he said, oh, look, I've got all the money for you to stay on and do a doctorate for 3 years, because we need a biography of Richard Cromwell. Nobody has studied the protectorate of Richard Cromwell. He was known as Tumble-Down Dick, as you might recall, because he wasn't the most effective of rulers. And I think nobody much was interested in him, poor chap, and I always liked the underdog, and so I was interested. But now I discover, I was talking with somebody at the University of East Anglia the other day, and there's still not a definitive biography of Richard Cromwell, so this may be an opportunity for retirement.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'll dig out my old essay. You know.
So you mentioned that you went on to theological college in Oxford. When was your decision that you weren't going to follow the historical path, you were going to go down a theological path?
Well, it is very interesting, because I went to university without a thought about, I mean, actually, everybody thought my older brother would be ordained because he was a prefect, he was well behaved, he wasn't in detention very much, didn't get into trouble. And everybody said about Roger, who became a head teacher, you know, a good one, you know, well, he'll be ordained, he'll follow in his father's footsteps. Nobody actually ever said that about me. But when I got to Lancaster University, there was a very flourishing and newly built chaplaincy centre. I mean, Lancaster was a new university. I was there in its 3rd or 4th year of existence. There were 2,000 students. I mean, now I've been back, there's 21,000. You know, it's a completely different world. But it felt quite intimate, really. And actually, I did fall into friendships with others. I discovered that in my kitchen area, there were 26 students in the County College, University of Lancaster. There were 2 other people who intended to be ordained. You know, that was most unusual in this very secular university, really. And actually, I suppose it was contemporaries who influenced me quite a lot. And it was halfway through that time I decided to offer myself for ordination, which I did, and then that meant I had to decide where to go on to train for ordination. My bishop, who was the Bishop of Peterborough, said, well, I think you should go to my college, and as he did, which was Cudston, just outside Oxford. And I thought, well, it's as good as anywhere else. So I went there, and that was the way all that worked. And then I did the postgraduate diploma in theology in the university while I was training for ordination.
So I presume then there had been a strong faith in the family, and you'd been brought up in a strong faith from Cornwall, Devon, Northampton.
Yeah, it was. I'd say it was. Nobody would have called my parents, if you know, particularly religious. You know, but it was just part of the air you breathed, and I think it's a bit like it's been in our family because both our children are not particularly religious, and yet they both did religious studies for A-level and got grade A's. And I remember Dominic, when he was here, being asked, well, why have you done religious studies for A-level? And he said, well, because it's easy.
I just add here, I did religious studies.
Well, there we are, you see. So it must be, yeah.
What grade did he get?
He got an A. Yeah.
Ah.
Mm. But I think it's sort of part of the air you breathe. Do you know? I mean, that, and you know, my parents didn't have formal family prayers or anything like that. So, and you were part of a full and active, interesting life. And so, it always seemed to me that faith enhanced life and all its possibilities. You know, it wasn't in any sense sort of closing down on options.
So you were ordained at Peterborough Cathedral, 1975, I think it was. Yeah. And it's a beautiful cathedral. It started about the same time as the magnificent cathedral we have here, and of course the final resting place of Catherine of Aragon.
Indeed.
Who was, of course, the great cause of the Reformation.
Yes, yes.
So it is, and your first curacy was Christ the Carpenter Church in Dogsthorpe.
Yes, no, that is quite a title.
Yeah.
If you travel in on the A47 from Wisbech, as some of you, well, perhaps all of you will have done, where there is a huge rubbish dump with all the seagulls, you know, that's my parish, Dogsthorpe. And it's the only church, I think, in the Anglican Communion dedicated to Christ the Carpenter, built in 1958. I think the idea for it, I was told the idea for it being Christ the Carpenter came from the bishop's wife at the time, who thought this might be nice for the artisans on the estates, who all worked for Peter Brotherhood Engineering or Frank Perkins, you know, the diesel engine enterprise in Peterborough. I mean, it was all pretty heavy industry. Baker Perkins, where Peterborough Jail now is, which did print machinery and biscuit making machinery. The people there worked on there were 3 really estates built in the 50s, 60s and 70s, and there was this rather unprepossessing church that was built in 1958. And it had been a daughter church. I was the first curate under the first vicar of the independent parish. And it was a great place to go. I mean, it was amazingly lively. The church was full on an ordinary Sunday. There was a daily communion service. We'd rarely have less than 10 at the daily services. Often, I mean, on a Wednesday lunchtime, it would be 40 or 50. I was president of the church cricket club. That's how we got the men into church, really. It wasn't Bible study. It was all the sorts of things I liked doing. We had a big amateur dramatic group. So did a pantomime every Christmas, and something in the summer. I can remember being Lord Arthur Savile in Lord Arthur Savile's Crime in our church hall, which drew them in, really. So you did all those things. People were socialised, really, into the church, I would have said. I mean, it taught me a lot as well, because I prepared for baptism and confirmation the treasurer of the cricket club, who was a local chap, coach driver. He was one of my great trophies, and then he ran off with all the money of the cricket club. And the chairman, the vice chair with me, threatened to punch him until he, until he saw the lights. And I said, well, that probably wasn't the most Christian way of going about it. But so it actually taught me at an early stage how to deal with quite tricky pastoral things, but it was a great experience. I wouldn't have changed it for anything, really.
So it was a good grounding.
I think that's what they like to call it. Yeah.
Good grounding.
Yeah, good grounding. Good grounding.
And so from there you went to Digswell, is that right? And then on to a role at Westminster.
Yeah, so that was, I went to Christ the King, Digswell, which seemed going up in the world after Christ the come to Dogsthorpe. And Digswell is part of Welwyn Garden City, so... but it was an even newer church on an even newer council estate built in 1964, and it had a very different experience. I went in 1979, by which time it had been open just over 14 years by the time I went, and I was the 7th priest in that church in 14 years. So you can see it hadn't had much stability. We stayed there 5 years, and that seemed to everybody there like an eternity. But it was a great. I mean, I started a residents' association on the estate. It was a very Welwyn Garden City. Some bits of it are very prosperous. This bit of it wasn't, and it had very few services. So, I started a residents' association, which led to the building of a community centre, which I suppose in some ways is my best testimony for the best legacy, really, of that place. And I only did that because we didn't have many people in church, but what we did have was a pub opposite the church. And I decided to take the bull by the horns and go in there in my cassock. And it was the sort of estate where it was the men who drank. The women stayed at home, and it was the men who were there.